Good morning, everybody. The Simple Handicap for Monday, September 16th. Thank you for making me a part of your morning. If you're wondering why on the earth are you saying good morning at this time and hour, it is 4:30 p.m. Pacific on a Sunday evening. We've been doing this for 7 years. It is the Week 2 recap episode. My initial reaction to all three Week 3 betting lines. If you're joining me for the first time here on the RAS Picks YouTube channel, we have started live streaming this for the first time this year, but it's the Sunday evening recap just before Sunday Night Football kicks off, as well as the look ahead to the week ahead with all of the numbers that are popping up. So I'm going to go through every game and make sense of everything we just saw on Sunday, and then we'll get through each game on the board and the market rundown, the first of the week, to look forward to all of the opening odds, and I'll give my true reaction. Haven't looked at them yet. I obviously know where the look ahead lines were, but it's something that I live react to every single Sunday evening here on the podcast feed. So thank you so much for everybody coming back. Looks like just under 100 folks joining in early in the stream. Last week, we got to a pretty big number too. So with all that said, let's get to it. Tommy G in for another show says, thank you for everything. Thank you for watching. And thankfully, a couple teams made this Sunday at least enjoyable. It was not a great dominant winning Sunday. We are 3-2 on the service. When I look back at the preview from Wednesday morning, a couple clunkers early. And when I look at Carolina, again, we'll talk about it. Dallas, certainly a big disappointment too, but a couple games really came through. The Tampa Bay, Detroit under. That one was pretty spot on. We were talking about the Green Bay quarterback situation and that number for the majority of the week. Also look at the Jets. We had a tough one in the Giants, Washington. The Cardinals, the Kansas City over went the right way as well. And then we got Pittsburgh at the end too. So a lot of good, a lot of bad. We'll recap everything starting off. Just want to say hello to Marcus in the live chat as well. Ryan has stopped by to say hello and follow along. Dave Clark is pumped. Steelers 2-0. Here we go. We'll talk about that one as well. Ryan's asking, is it Andy Dalton time? That's game number 2. We'll talk about that one in just a second. I want to also remind everybody that over on bettingtalk.com, you can find all of the written write-ups for every game each week, which includes a weekly preview that is published Friday and Saturday, as well as initial recaps, injury reports live as they happen. That is available over at bettingtalk.com. So, okay, let's start off. Las Vegas goes into Baltimore, 26-23 victory. Can you believe that one? Blowing up survivor pools everywhere. Last week was Cincinnati. This week, Baltimore. I'll be sweating Houston later tonight. We also have Houston on the service on the side, -6, and we've got the first half under 22.5 on the release show. So lots to sweat for the Sunday night game for myself. I'm sure other people in the same boat with Survivor as well. Raiders cover. Raiders win outright, and it was kind of a shocking outcome when you consider how that game went. And I think back to week 1 last week when the Raiders were playing the Chargers, and it was a game full of just getting beat up front for the Raiders on defense. And as the game went on, that's when the Chargers started to find more and more success running the football and just wear down the Raiders. It was uncharacteristic for an Antonio Pierce-led Raiders team. And in this game against Baltimore, you see the Ravens get out to a 23-13 lead with 12 minutes to play at home. The Ravens then went on to concede 13 points and 160 yards on the subsequent 3 drives for the Raiders. And so it was a spot where I thought the Ravens got that lead, would start relying on the run game, wear down the Raiders. Just wasn't the case. It was the opposite. The Raiders offense completely stalled out on their next 2 drives, -1 yards total, while the Raiders put up 160 and score a touchdown along with 2 field goals to end up winning that game. Shocked to see how that one played out. And I think it's kind of now apparent when you watch the Ravens defense losing all of the guys they lost in the offseason. They lost Anthony Weaver. They obviously lose Mike McDonald. They also lost a defensive coach who's now the DC over in Tennessee. And you see Zach Orr, who was the 3rd guy up to run this defense, maybe you're losing a little bit of that brain power that you had last year, and that's starting to impact some of these games. Now, there's certainly blame to put on the offense and how ineffective it was down the stretch, but defensively, they didn't have an answer for Adams. They didn't have an answer for Bowers. Gardner Minshew got very pass-happy late for the Raiders playing catch-up. 15 of 16 plays on those 2 drives to score and tie it up were all passes. And you look at the numbers for Minshew, completed 83% of his passes against this Ravens defense, 30 for 38, believe it or not, for 276 yards. Minshew was 15.6% above expectation. And so that was all done in spite of not having any ground game. The Raiders, 27 yards on 17 carries. It was a 5th percentile rushing effort from Las Vegas. So it was shocking, quite frankly, to say how that one played out when you look at how similar it was looking to week one, and the Raiders flipped the script and end up pulling up the upset, a major win for Las Vegas on the road, who now goes back home to host Carolina. We'll talk about in game number 2 as the Chargers end up winning 26-3 on the road in Carolina. And it's another week where there's just nothing positive to take away. I'm at wit's end here. I mean, this is disappointing on every level. It's becoming slightly embarrassing when I look back at the takes, because naturally the good takes never get brought up, but the bad ones will haunt you forever. And I'm hanging on to a pretty bad one here with Carolina, because there's just no optimism at all in what this offense is doing. And I want to start defensively and just kind of highlight how bad this was for a second week in a row. The Chargers finished with a 53% success rate on all plays. The game was never competitive. LA was getting anything that they wanted on the ground all day long. It was a 92nd percentile performance for the Chargers offense, who just dominated the line of scrimmage. J.K. Dobbins went for 131 rushing yards on 17 carries. But this is kind of reinforcing how bad it is and how certainly one-sided the Chargers offense wants to be, but how the Chargers ran the football 44 times in this game up against the just 20 passes for Justin Herbert. I'm very curious to see if the stream is still running or not. Let me know if I did freeze up for a second there, so hopefully it comes through. But it was 44 rushes, to just 20 passes. It was just the Chargers lining up at the line of scrimmage, getting whatever they wanted and having a ton of success doing it. And on the other side, it was just anemic offense. And I think that that's kind of a compliment. If you're putting it in context, Bryce Young, 18 for 26. That side looks okay, but then you see 84 yards, and you're like, what is happening? Minus 0.76 EPA per attempt. That was the worst of the season for any quarterback so far. It was worse than Bo Nix last week. Just horrendous. And I'm looking at this number. I don't have the records for EPA per play by game sorted going back the last couple seasons. I would think for a quarterback that has at least 20 attempts, that has got to be a record low for how bad and ineffective it was for the Panthers on offense. And I guess my question for Carolina now is, I think back to 2019 and the Miami Dolphins. They started the season as a 7-point underdog in week 1. They were an 18-point underdog in week 2. They were a 22-point underdog in week 3, and then they were 16.5-point underdog in week 4. Carolina, as we know, was a dog in week 1. They took a little bit of money. In week 2, they got up as high as 6.5. That was about a 6-point adjustment from market numbers, week 1 to week 2. Where are we going to go week 3? They go back to take on the Raiders. It's not like the Raiders are going to command a massive point spread, but how is the market going to treat this team? I think it'll be interesting to see the opening odds in a couple minutes here on the podcast later on to see what it gets to. But man, I mean, 2 for 22, the Panthers are on third downs this season. This is all kind of levels of bad. And so 1 of 12 on third down against the Chargers. There's no sustained drives. There's no sustained offense. How high does this keep going? I don't know where this stops. And perhaps the bright side of looking at it in terms of the season-long prediction is the Dolphins team, which comparatively from a point spreads perspective was significantly worse pricing-wise than what we're seeing with the Panthers. That team still ended up winning 5 games, and that was a 1-game shorter season. So maybe there's still some optimism there, but boy, that's a head shaker in Carolina. Speaking of a head shaker and speaking of another egg on face, so to speak, prediction over the week, New Orleans 44, Dallas 19. I'm blown away by this result, quite frankly. Like, I was doing the box score recap. I was looking through the play-by-play. I was pulling up the EPA numbers. I don't know what to make of it, because on paper coming into the game, it was like, this is a Saints offense that looked great. And my explanation was they looked great because they played the Panthers. And this O-line, which was widely a concern. It wasn't an out-of-line prediction to say it was a worry. Wasn't an issue in week 1. I figure, okay, that makes sense because the Panthers had no pass rush. Cowboys have arguably a top 3 pass rush in the league, widely accepted as a consensus opinion, and it was just a non-issue for the Saints moving to football. They go into Dallas, and it looked like the Green Bay Packers in the playoffs and what performance the Saints put up. 430 yards of offense plus 2.4 in net per play, 4 for 5 of the red zone, 14.2 yards per pass for the Saints and Derek Carr against this Cowboys defense. He found a 57 and a 70-yard completion for a touchdown. The Saints scored on their first 6 drives, 16 passes for Derek Carr plus 0.78 EPA per play. The inverse of what we just talked about with Bryce Young. As good as Derek Carr was, that was as bad as Bryce Young was on the other side of the equation. 99th percentile performance for Derek Carr and this offense. Just incredible. 89% offensive series success rate. I mean, I can just keep going on with how good this was. And you start to wonder, like Clint Kubiak coming back to run this offense, night and day from what we saw with Pete Carmichael. Complete turnaround for the Saints. 2 massive games to start the season. We're talking about where the prices go with the Panthers, where do prices start to go with the Saints? Now at 2-0, 2 40-plus point performances. This is all kinds of dominance from the Saints so far on offense through 2 weeks. On the other side for the Cowboys, Dallas didn't punt in the first half. Neither team did. But still, the Cowboys found themselves down multiple scores because they settled for field goals. And Dak threw a pick in New Orleans territory, which was returned 47 yards the other way to set up a short field going backwards. Prescott threw still for 293, showing that even with some garbage time aided numbers, the Saints defense is still a little bit of a question mark. But what stood out to me was the Cowboys in that first half were going against the Saints defense that did not have their best corner in Marshawn Lattimore. And it wasn't until later in the second quarter and into the third quarter that the Cowboys really started to move the football. And that Lamb play that went for a big score, 65 yards, that was kind of the effect of not having Lattimore. 2 really bad missed tackles. But still, even without their best corner in the defensive backfield, the Saints were comfortable wire to wire in this game. So some of the Cowboys numbers certainly aided by the fact that there was 100 yards added, trailing by 3 or 4 touchdowns in the second half, and it made these numbers look a little bit better. But woof, that Saints offense, mighty impressive all the way through. Ryan Roberts says, you froze, but you're back now. Okay, I'm glad to hear. Spooked me for a second there as everything froze up that was being put on the screen. Lots of comments coming in. I'll jump back and get to them as we go. I'll try to keep things moving with the recap here going game by game. Tampa Bay on the road at the Detroit Lions. Another surprising result, 20-16. The game stays under. And this was a pretty incredible box score to look through when you see the Buccaneers come away with a 4-point victory. I feel like this was far more about the Lions' failure to capitalize than it was the Bucs coming through with a dominant 4-quarter performance. So let's just talk about how wonky things got for the Detroit Lions. Now, you heard me talk about it. You heard every podcast talk about it. You heard every network talk about it. The Buccaneers defense was really banged up in the defensive backfield, down multiple starters, down multiple depth guys. And it was very evident from the start of the game that Ben Johnson knew this as well and made it a focal point of the offense. Jared Goff threw 55 passes in this game for 5.8 yards attempt. Johnson said, you guys have the injuries. We're going to go right at it. And he did. Like, crazy to see Goff with those numbers in a game where the Lions, like, it wasn't like the Lions were behind 2 or 3 touchdowns. It was a competitive game, wire to wire, and he was just trying to pummel the secondary. The Lions ran 83 plays in this game to just 47 for Tampa Bay, and the Lions outgained the Buccaneers by 247 total yards. They were plus 1.0 in net yards per play. They had 7 red zone drives with first downs. Ready for this one? The Lions had first downs at the Tampa Bay 10, 18, 20, 1, 20, 22, and 13. On those drives, they scored just 1 touchdown, settled for 2 field goals, and 2 of them ended with 0 points scored. And so this was a case of the Lions drive after drive after drive, getting the football deep into Buccaneers territory and either settling for field goals or making mistakes. And it was crazy to watch how ineffective the Lions got. And it was a second glimpse this season of the Lions getting away from a ground game that is their biggest asset. And the fact that even without Vita Vea, who went out with injury, the Bucs still didn't have Cansey in the front of their defensive front 7. Even without those guys there, the Lions still didn't want to run the football very much, and they were still unable to really give Goff a clean pocket as often as they would want to. And that's kind of a testament to Todd Bowles and that aggression that he is able to bring. This Lions run game was gaining 0.12 EPA per attempt. They had a 40% success rate, which is solid for a running attack, and the Lions just didn't want to go to it. So it almost ended up costing them going away from it in the Rams game on Sunday night last week. And I feel like this week they could have gone to it a little bit more, and it was just a failure to capitalize on so many levels. Mayfield, amazing on early downs passing, another solid game from him, but the Buccaneers just weren't on the field all that much to have a lot of plays come through and make a difference. Early down pass rate, 56% success rate. He had 18 attempts, finished 7.9% below expectation, but it was a game where he didn't make any crippling mistakes. He didn't have any big blunders and just did what was necessary with the few plays that he had to be out there on the field. Again, it's just a failure by the Lions in this game to capitalize on getting it inside Tampa Bay territory nearly every single drive. Crazy results continue. Green Bay Packers 16, Indianapolis 10. I wouldn't put this in the crazy results like the Ravens or the Lions or the Saints. I think this one, I don't want to say was expected because there was a lot of uncertainty with Malik Willis, but in terms of how this game transpired and the way it took place, it was pretty jarring. And so we'll talk about the QB stuff coming up because we have to talk about Tua. We're going to have to talk about the Packers. It continues to be every week there's a QB change, that point spread going out too far. And this was another example. We were talking about how it was 6 for the majority of the week. It hung around an 8-point adjustment. Lots of these injuries being very much blown up. Now, when you look at this game specifically, I woke up 6 a.m. Pacific, was getting ready for the day, and there's an alert that comes through on the phone, and it's talking about how Matt LaFleur was caught by a reporter. I don't know exactly what it was. He said the run game's going to be the focus. Josh Jacobs going to be featured. I heard that, and I'm like, that makes sense. And then you look back at this box score. The Packers ran the football 53 times in the game. They had 53 rush attempts. It was the most runs for a Packers offense since 1978. And the fact that they did it against this Colts defense, which under the current regime the last couple of years has been so good at tackling, like they just said, we don't have a quarterback. We're going to play around it. We're just going to run it as much as you can. Now, here's what's misleading about these numbers. The Packers were up 10-0. They had a fumble at the goal line, which would have made it 17-0, ends up 10-0. And you look at the game as a whole, the rush EPA numbers were minus 0.21 per attempt. And the success rate was 23rd percentile for the Packers. And so when you take a step back and you look at the game, it was quite an ineffective offense as a whole. When you're looking down by down and play by play, what happened was, I think the Colts made an adjustment. This is not a game I've watched back yet in detail. All the numbers for the Packers fell off in the second half. And so the Packers had nearly 200 rushing yards just a few minutes into the second quarter. And then they kind of hung on. And so depending on when you look at these numbers, and now we're looking at it from a post-game perspective, wasn't very good overall for the Packers. And that's just because running the football becomes quite ineffective over time relative to passing it and how much more effective passing can be. But for the Packers to employ this game plan, execute it early to build that lead to be able to hang on to, it was very effective in doing that in the first and the second quarter. So I don't want to look at this and say this was a really bad game from the Packers. It wasn't. They did what they needed to do to play around the situation, but it just kind of shows how unsustainable having your quarterback attempt 14 passes in a game while you run it 53 times for an 80% run rate is going to be going forward. So it's really a matter of how many more times can the Packers get away with this until Jordan Love returns. Something else that really helped the Packers in this game was the Colts ended up losing DeForest Buckner. He's a key defensive lineman, the best that they have. Once he went out, it allowed the Packers to sustain things just long enough to hold out to win this game. Now, when you look at this as a whole, the Colts actually outgained the Packers by 0.7 yards per play. They also put up 338 yards of total offense. So there's still concerns here about the Packers defense, despite the Colts only scoring 10. And I think it was a data point that you add on to Brazil, where there was some doubt. And it's like, wow, did the field conditions in Brazil make a difference? Because this is really what the Packers defense is. And then you see the Colts come in a sloppy game, hang 340. and you're like, okay, there might still be concerns here for the Packers defense. Richardson throws 3 picks. They came at the Green Bay 13, the Green Bay 25, and the Green Bay 9. Now, the third pick was late in the game. It was a desperation heave, so you're downgrading that a little bit. The Colts also missed a 50-yard field goal. The Colts did not punt in the second half. Believe it or not, they had 6 drives, still couldn't make it competitive. So some positives, obviously, that the Packers were able to get out with a win, but I still think some negatives loom over this defense. Now, something to think about going forward and something to circle. The Colts have been outrushed by opponents 474 yards to 244 yards in the first 2 weeks, nearly double. Massive rushing numbers conceded for the Colts defense. They've also, because of this, been on the field for at least 40 minutes in both week 1 and week 2. The offense has not been able to hold the ball for more than 20 minutes. Shane Steichen has been wildly aggressive throwing the football in the first 2 weeks of the season. There's now defensive injuries starting to accumulate for the Colts, and I wonder if we see some protection efforts for the defense beginning in week 3 start to be employed by the offense, because this Colts run game should be the unit that is dominating games. And it hasn't been that through the first 2 weeks. And you start to see injuries along with this just wild time of possession deficit start to accumulate. Let's see if the Colts kind of change things up on offense going forward. So let's see about that going into week 3. Cleveland goes into Jacksonville and wins 18-13. The Jaguars outgained the Browns by 1.3 yards per play, 1.0 yards per pass, and 1.7 yards per rush. Interesting. Becomes a bit of a misleading box score. Okay, so the Jags must have turned the ball over, right? If they're losing 18-13, they're outgaining the opponent by 1.3 yards per play. They're outgaining their opponent yards per pass, yards per rush. They must be turning the ball over, right? 0 turnovers for Jacksonville in this game. So what in the world happened? Why Cleveland goes into Jacksonville, they get outgained per play, per pass, per rush. They don't dominate turnovers. What's going on? Well, as we've seen in a number of games, it's red zone offense for the Jags that killed them. They had drives that settled for field goals with first downs at the Cleveland 2, not once, but twice. Twice in the game, a first down at the Cleveland 2-yard line, and they settled for field goals. Jacksonville also missed a 43-yard field goal, and they conceded a safety. So it's a frustrating game for Jags backers, no question about it. We were on the Jags side, and you're watching those drives where the Browns defense just takes over at the goal line, and you just left shaking your head for the Jags offense. And that was a pretty frustrating one to look at. Now, where I kind of struggle with this is, does it get the full label of a misleading box score, or is this something else going on? Because it's hard to fully put that stamp on this game. When I go through and I look at Trevor Lawrence and his passing numbers, he finished 13.4% below expectation. He completed only 50% of his throws, just 192 yards. Don't know what to make of this Jags offense going forward. Just an ineffective, frustrating game from them this week, in a game that, just based on how they were, should have won. Last week, they're up 17-7. They fumble at the goal line. It should have been a 3-score lead. They end up losing that game against Miami. Could very well make the case that the Jags should have won both of the games based on how they played out, and to some extent the box score. But again, you look last week, and it was the Jags on the flip side of this where they lose, but the Dolphins hang 400 yards of offense on them. Defensively for the Jags, the first drive for Cleveland, I thought looked good for Deshaun Watson. Was a long drive, went more than 9 minutes, ends in a touchdown. But beyond that, the Cleveland Browns never entered the red zone again. So it was that one drive early, and then the Jags defense played pretty consistently for the next 3.5 quarters, really. And so Watson throws for just 4.8 yards per pass, and that was against this Jags defense, which was without its best corner in Tyson Campbell. Don't know where Amari Cooper has gone. 3 catches for 11 yards. Weird game, weird scoreline, weird box score, weird result. Would like to think that this was kind of misleading in favor of the Jags, but based on how Trevor Lawrence looked and played, I just don't know about that one. Next game up, San Francisco on the road at the Minnesota Vikings. Vikings win 23-17. The game stays under on a total that was bet up consistently all week. It was like every time I was looking, there's over money coming into this, and I'm left just unsure by it. Now, if you had the over in this game, that's a pretty unlucky bet. And this game, despite being a 23-17 final, this played like a dead over. When you look at the box score in the rearview mirror here, 800 plus total yards for the two teams, and it still finishes 6 points short of a pretty attainable number in the mid-40s. Both teams finish with greater than 50% success rates on offense, and both teams finish with 70+% series success rates as well. So you have 800 yards. The game falls under. Like, what was going on here? What are we looking at? Now, nearly 300 of the 800 yards of offense came on just 3 drives. Justin Jefferson had a 97-yard touchdown reception. San Francisco had an 88-yard drive, believe it or not, that finished in 0 points. They also had a 99-yard touchdown drive that ended up in a TD. So those 2 drives kind of offset for San Francisco. And then you have the big play from Minnesota that bolsters it, because you start to wonder how this much offense doesn't result in an over. And if you're not seeing crazy results somewhere that don't make a lot of sense, it typically comes in the field position manner. And that's exactly what we saw here. It was just a lot of San Francisco yardage came when they were pinned way back, and it just results in these big numbers. You don't get there. Now, that is not to say that there wasn't a lot of luck and kind of back and forth wonky stuff that went on in this game. I look at the Vikings. They scored a field goal off of a blocked punt in San Francisco territory. They picked off Brock Purdy inside the San Francisco 10 in another drive that started really deep for the 49ers. But then on the flip side, Minnesota fumbled at the San Francisco 2. Darnold was picked off at the San Francisco 10 by Fred Warner. And so it was just 5 drives that ended with failed red zone opportunities or turnovers inside the 10-yard line. It was a lot of long drives, a lot of backed up field position, but a lot of offense that is undeniable by both sides that should have absolutely resulted in an over. I've seen mixed reports on how Brock Purdy played. He finished 17.4% above expectation for his completion rate. He completed 77.8% of his passes. It's another good stat line against the Flores defense, but it was another game that was marred by some key turnovers and key mistakes that probably made him look a little bit better than his performance actually was. Darnold serviceable for another week, and this Vikings team is 2-0 headed into week number 3. Seattle goes into New England and wins 23-20 in overtime. The game goes over with 55 seconds to play in the fourth quarter on the game-tying field goal. It was a close game that went back and forth, a lot of scoring early, a lot of offense on a lot of passing. Pats went very pass-heavy early, and that led to a lot of scoring early. And then in the second half, both of these defenses adjusted, kind of dialed things down. When you take a step back and you look at the box score, the Seahawks outgained New England by 0.7 yards per play, and they were plus 5% in net success rate. What stood out to me, though, in this game was just how different the Seattle Seahawks offense looked. And I think that was really driven by the absence of Kenneth Walker, who sounds like is in line to miss a couple more weeks and a couple more games. It's being labeled as not wanting to rush him back. So in week 1 against the Denver Broncos, the Seattle Seahawks run the football 55% of the time. This week against New England, which is a better defense than what they faced in Denver, with a better defensive front, knowing that they won't have George Fant, knowing they won't have Kenneth Walker, Ryan Grubb in Seattle threw the football 44 times to just 19 rush attempts. Only 14 of the 19 runs were designed for running back. So 44 passes to just 14 running back carries, all of those by Zach Charbonnet. So really pass heavy for Seattle all game against a good defensive front. Gino was constantly under duress, but man, played just a hell of a game. When you look back at what he was able to do, constantly under pressure, dealing without a run game to support him in any way. Second most pass attempts for him in a game in his entire career. He completes 73.8% of his throws for a 55% passing success rate. which is an 83rd percentile game. If there's worry about Geno Smith and his passing abilities in this offense, this game against New England was a glimpse of what it can be when everything gets together and clicks. Like, that is a good Patriots defense, and Geno Smith had no problems throwing under duress all day into it. Defensively for Seattle, I think they kind of got caught off guard by how pass-heavy the Pats went initially, but then it was the Pats' power running game that went right at the teeth of the Seahawks defense. They gave up a really big run, 45 yards to Gibson, but other than that, thought it held up relatively well, certainly better than what we saw from Cincinnati. Stevenson had 81 yards on 21 touches, 42% overall success rate, which is a solid number for running the football. And so a bit of a mixed bag, but against this strength of the Pats offense, thought they held up well. The problem for Seattle in this game, and what we might see going forward, is they lose two middle linebackers from this game. And once that happened, the Seahawks had no answer for Hunter Henry. And so that's something to watch for on the injury report, because it certainly changes the middle of this defense and how the Seahawks are going to defend going forward. New York Jets 24, Tennessee Titans 17. Look at this game, and it was the Titans outgaining the Jets by 0.3 yards per play. They outgained them by 35 total yards, 0.2 per pass, and 0.4 per rush. Tennessee Titans lose by 7, but in a game where it's consistently outgaining the opponent across the board and shutting them out in terms of the net per play differential in every category, you wonder what had to happen. And this was a case where it was the Titans being undone by mistakes that they and Will Levis made. Now, Tennessee's driving deep into Jets territory. Second quarter, they're up 7-0. Chance to go up 14-0. We're on the Jets in the service, -3.5. And like, I'm writing this off. It was a bad first and second quarter this morning for how everything was looking. And I'm writing this off. And then Will Levis, just tries to extend the play. Just a mind-numbing fumble and turnover that immediately just kind of flips the game back and give the Jets hope. Now, the Jets punt off of that, so it's not like the Jets capitalized immediately on the turnover. But then Levis comes out the next drive after that fumble and throws an INT on a deep shot. That ended up setting the Jets up for a game-tying touchdown. And then in the third quarter, the Jets get the punt block to add on to recurring mistakes for the Tennessee Titans. They go up with a mid-fourth quarter drive, 73 yards to lead 24-17 and hold on. The Titans, again, drive down late. I've got on the TV and I'm watching. I go, this is it. Like, we just lost the Washington Giants total, which we'll talk about in a second, in just like the worst possible fashion. Here's the Jets hanging on to a lead. I'm like, this is how it's going to end. They get inside the Jets 10. About 30 seconds left on the clock. Will Levis takes a sack, and he's incomplete on fourth down. Jets hang on, win 24-17, and kind of escape, because to me, that was a massive drive on defense for the Jets to hang on, because if you concede that, maybe they go for 2, maybe you drop it in overtime. The spot for the Jets here was kind of tough. You play San Francisco Monday night, fly into Tennessee, you play the early game, and then you've got the Pats on deck on Thursday Night Football. This is the easy chunk of the schedule after the bad loss against San Francisco in week 1. If you drop this and go to 0-2, and then you add in the fact that Jermaine Johnson with the Achilles rupture going to be out for the season. You don't have pass rushers anymore. Will McDonald looked great, but you still don't have Reddick. Johnson was the guy for 7.5 sacks last season. He's lost. You lose C.J. Mosley in this game against Tennessee, the heart and soul and captain of the middle of this defense. And so I think this was huge for the Jets, because if you lose this one and you're 0-2, and now you're down your second best corner, your defensive captain in Mosley in the middle, your best pass rusher in Johnson, you still don't have a Reddick answer, which looks like a lost cause. And it's 0-2. Like, this is a coaching staff that's on the hot seat as is. And to rally that on a short week, I think would have been brutal. Now, they don't have to deal with that because they escape with the win. Paints Thursday Night Football in a much different light for the Jets. I still think I look at Rodgers and you have to say he's healthier than expected at times. I thought he held on to the ball for too long, and that's something you can't be doing. I thought he tried to really force some throws open to wide receivers. But to me, that's kind of like a limitation of the offense. And early on, the run game, again, just up the middle, was doing nothing. I love the change of pace they brought in with Allen. I think that gives them an interesting look. we'll see what this develops into. But I still hang on to the fact that Rodgers is looking better than I think we all expected him to be, and that has to be a bit of a positive. For the Titans, my last note here, there was so much talk about the increased pass rate over expectation for Tennessee in the offseason. It was Brian Callahan coming in, way more passing, way more 11 personnel. This is going to be an aggressive offense. It's pushing the ball downfield. Week 1, 5% below expectation for pass rate. Don't have the PROE numbers for this game. Hard not to ignore the Titans' 28 pass attempts to 28 rush attempts, 50-50 down the middle. I would be shocked if that comes out above 0 for pass rate over expectation. So it's 2 games in 2 weeks for Tennessee that I think they're probably going to be around that negative 5%. I don't know why I said negative, minus 5% mark. We haven't seen that offensive change yet click for Tennessee. So we'll see if that comes to it. This is the heartbreaker of the week. This is a wild box score and a wild game to talk about. Washington wins 21-18. We had the over in the service at 42, closes 43.5. 2 bad defenses, 2 bad secondaries. If you cover everything up, sometimes I'll pull up the box score and I'll put my hand, or I'll take a notebook and I'll cover part of the screen and I'll slowly reveal it and I'll go down, you go play by play, or maybe you're scrolling on the phone, you have it covered to try to build the suspense as you're looking at the scores, right? If you covered up everything, you just showed total of 43.5, 730 total yards, and you told me that one team never punted in the game. You told me I had an over 42 ticket. One team never punted. The 2 teams combined for 730 yards. I'm like, this, I mean, we made a great bet, right? Like, that's a dead over. No. Well, honestly, it didn't really even come close at the end. Maybe Giants could have got in on that second to last drive, but like it was dire to get to 21-18. So what in the world happened? As I said, Washington never punted. 0 punts for the Washington Commanders. Washington had 7 drives all game. Every single drive that Washington had gained at least 43 yards. Every single drive that Washington had went to at least the Giants' 27-yard line or beyond. Every single drive for Washington ended in a field goal. The Washington Commanders had first downs at the Giants 10, 6, 8, 11, 14, 24, and 13. They went 0 for 6 in the red zone. Did not convert any of those into touchdowns. The crazy part about all of this, despite losing the over and just being completely annoyed at how this played out, is that during the broadcast, it was referenced multiple times about how this is the type of defense that Shane Bowen for the Giants wants to run. This is what he wants to have out of his defense. So the Giants are turning into what they're not a good defense to begin with beyond the front 4. It's a bad secondary. It's a bad group of safeties. We've talked about it a ton. But now they're employing this like ultimate bend but don't break style that they apparently want to take to just the most extreme extent, because the Washington Commanders offense, despite putting up 400 plus yards of offense, was still struggling to get the ball distributed to wide receivers. Like, it wasn't a clean operation from Washington, and they just went up and down the field every single drive. You look back and the Commanders are inside the red zone. They just didn't get the ball into the end zone. Oh boy. This was tough to watch. Now, on the other side for the Giants, they moved the football a ton too. Don't take away from the 18 points that the Giants were struggling. More than 300 yards of offense. The problem was for the Giants, even though they only punted twice in the game, they fumbled at the Washington 47. They failed on 4th and short at the Washington 22. They scored 3 touchdowns. And you wonder, how the hell did they score 3 touchdowns and 18 points? Pre-game warm-ups, their kicker, Graham Gano, gets injured. So he's out. So they have this Scottish Hammer in as their field goal kicker for the game. On the first touchdown, he misses an extra point by 25 yards. And so Dable's like, no, we're done with that. We're not, no more Scottish Hammer for field goal attempts. So they go 0 for 2 on 2-point conversions. And even though they were consistently again in Washington territory, the idea of kicking a field goal never crossed the mind for Dable and the Giants. So it was like, that was out of the question. Man, to look at this, it's just, It's brutal to see that this one stayed under, but it might be viewed as a 21 to 18, 39 point under game. That's like, well, the defenses are better than they are. No, both of these defenses are really, really poor. So missed 2-pointers on both. Both QBs were plus 0.20 in EPA per pass, and both teams were 45% or greater in offensive success rate. So this is good. Now, Ryan Roberts, technically they kneeled into halftime. They had a one-play, one kneel-down drive. I'm not counting that as a full drive in it, but that's how it looked. So, like, man, that was a tough one to end the morning. We ended up 1-2, and then we went 2-0 in the afternoon to get to 3-2. And as I said, we've got the Houston side pending as well as that first half under. Let's get to the afternoon games. Won't go as far in depth with these as we're now bleeding into the 40-minute mark, but also they just finished up as we came online. And quite frankly, 2 of the 3 games don't really deserve anything to talk about. So Cardinals beat up on the Rams 41-10. You look at the yards per play numbers, more than 3 yards per play better were the Cardinals, 11.7 yards per pass for Arizona to just 6 yards for the Rams, 5.8 yards per rush for Arizona, 2.7 for the Rams. Complete beatdown, complete embarrassment. And it was just completely the matchups that we talked about on the preview podcast coming to fruition for Arizona, who got just major advantages on both sides of the football. Very simple going forward. How do you beat the Arizona Cardinals? You run the ball between the tackles from heavy personnel. You stay consistent with it. If you have a mobile quarterback, the better. You take it right at the middle of this defense. If you're a team that runs a lot of dual blocking schemes, you're going to have success. That's how you beat the Cardinals defense. That's what we saw the Bills do for success. When it comes to the Rams in this game, they had so many offensive line injuries. They just couldn't do it. You look at some of the rushing numbers for the Rams, and I know it was out of hand early, but Kyron Williams, 12 carries for 25 yards. Blake Corum, 8 carries for 28 yards. This Rams offensive line at the moment is non-functional. So that was problem number one. They couldn't execute on that. Now you flip that around. If you're defending the Rams or if you're defending the Cardinals, what do you have to do? Well, you have to have a really versatile defense, because what Arizona wants to do on offense, 12 and 13 personnel, mash James Conner into your defense behind the offensive line, rely on the size. And when you drop in that extra body to defend the run, they're going to rely on these big pass catchers in one-on-one matchups. The Rams got a little bit aggressive early. Marvin Harrison burns them twice. Then they start to play off a little bit, and you see James Conner, 21 carries for 122. Kyler Murray adds 60 rushing, because once you start to commit to the back, you got Kyler Murray and his mobile ability. I mean, the Arizona Cardinals emptied the bench for running backs, 231 total rushing yards, 40 carries to just 21 passes. But Murray's 21 passes, he's 17 of 21 for 266 and 3 touchdowns. This Cardinals team is really, really matchup specific on a weekly basis. The Bills matched up pretty well on both sides and were able to hang on, stay consistent, and win. The Rams did not. And when you get a team like the Rams going forward that does not match up against the Cardinals are going to do this. These games are going to look like this. The Cardinals games are always going to be high scoring. I have them for more than 500 points on the season. They're over 75 already for the year. They're on pace. This is what the Cardinals are going to do every single week when the matchups present themselves like this. Now, let's not lose sight of the fact that this Cardinals defense is very exploitable. When you have a Rams offensive line like they do, it's not going to work. When you lose Cooper Kupp in the game and you're already down Puka Nacua and you're relying on DeMarcus Robinson as wide receiver number 1, it's not going to work. But we really have a very good and clear idea of what this Cardinals team is going forward through 2 weeks. Kansas City 26, Cincinnati 25. This was a game that we had the over on, and we end up getting that to come home for us, but it was certainly never easy. A lot of stalled red zone drives on both sides of the football. You look at this game, just over 600 yards. So, if you were watching that game, it felt like both teams were going back and forth all game long. The Giants and Commanders had 130 more yards than the Chiefs and Bengals did in that matchup between Joe Burrow and Patrick Mahomes. To just kind of put in perspective how you look at these scorelines, and you get kind of different outcomes from it. But Inside the red zone, 2 for 4 for the Bengals, 1 for 2 for the Chiefs. Cincinnati hangs on late. Really not a whole lot to say or take away from this. I think we get a better look at what the Bengals are. I think the Chiefs, in many ways, were lucky to escape this. I'm not pointing any fingers at the refs for aiding that. I think that that is a narrative that is more than overblown when you look at the end game here. The Bengals, 8 penalties for 79 yards. The Chiefs, 4 for 44. It might prove the point initially, but really, if you're going to look at those late calls, the pass interference was pass interference. There's no way around that. It's what it was. It was the right call. When you look on the other side, that hands to the face, if anything, I thought was a little bit soft when you're looking at how that matches up. So, yeah, I don't have too many big takeaways from this. It's a game I want to go back and watch again. I thought Joe Burrow looked a lot more like himself. There's no question that the Bengals desperately need T. Higgins back. Mike Gesicki with a couple key drops as well, but still a big stat line for him. But inside the red zone, when things bogged down for Cincinnati, it was pretty ugly at times where they were struggling to get it across the goal line. But bigger takeaways for this on the podcast throughout the week as we go forward. And then the last game that we have to talk about was the Pittsburgh Steelers on the road at the Denver Broncos. 13-6 win for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Really don't need to spend a whole lot of time here. When you look at the stat line, this was quite inflated by the Broncos in garbage time with a couple bigger drives that aided and padded their stats. Now the Broncos do end up in the final box score 1 yard per play better, 1.2 yards per pass better. It was a game that when you look at it, if you just looked from the backward facing view at the box score, tried to project what happened, you would have thought the Broncos should have been a little bit more fortunate, but it was a game really where the Broncos were never competitive in it. And it was a game that the Steelers scored on their second drive, went 12 plays for 78 yards, almost 8 minutes to lead 7-0. And the Broncos followed that up with a punt, followed it up with the turnover on downs. And the Broncos were never really threatening on that until later in the third quarter. They get to the Pittsburgh 6 and end up turning it over with an interception deep in the Pittsburgh Steelers end zone. That was kind of the game saver for Pittsburgh to hold on to that lead because the Steelers offense was not pushing the tempo. They were not dictating the game. It was a big play late. But I start to kind of look at how the Broncos, they handled the final 3 drives. The field goal down 13-3 that was kicked on 4th and 6 from the Steelers 16. At that point, you're kicking to make a 2-score game still a 2-score game early in the fourth quarter with 10 minutes to play. It certainly should have gone for that. No question about it. You could have also made the case that down 13-6 at the time that they should have gone forward and tried to pick up the 4th down, 4th and 5 on the Pittsburgh 11 at the 2-minute warning. They chose to kick the field goal again to bring it to a 7-point deficit. And then they elect not to take the onside kick attempt, despite only having 1 timeout, which set them up with a 1-play drive deep in their own end with 9 seconds left. So I could kind of point to 3 blunders to end this game by Sean Payton that left me kind of scratching my head watching that. And I just, boy, you have to kind of look at that as a bit of a downgrade when you're thinking about coaching and end game scenarios, but it's not like the Broncos have much room to be downgraded at all. So just head scratching decisions by Payton late. And it is a Steelers win and cover and a win on the service for Pittsburgh as well. That is the full recap of every game that we saw. Some key injuries. Obviously, the Cooper Kupp news is big. I saw someone put in the chat that Pacheco left the game in a boot. I didn't see that before I came on the stream. Some other injuries. Obviously, Tua from Thursday Night Football. Terron Armstead, the Dolphins left tackle. Big. McDaniel said he hopes to have him back sooner than later. The Bills lose Terrell Bernard. The heartbeat of their defense is referred to multiple players at the end. They're also without Taron Johnson, their best nickel corner. The Jets, as I mentioned, C.J. Mosley, a big loss, highly rated linebacker, leader in the middle of the defense. Jermaine Johnson, 83 PFF grade last year, 7.5 sacks last year, was their big hope for edge rush without Hassan Riddick. He's going to be out what looks like for the rest of the season. Really long-term injury and just a massive blow with both of those guys being lost for the Jets. Tampa Bay loses Vita Vea. You've heard me say it for 7 years on the podcast. Never underestimate the value of losing a good nose tackle. We'll have to see what that injury is for the Buccaneers. They're already down Cansey on the defensive line as well. Indianapolis loses DeForest Buckner in the middle of that defensive front. Leatu Latu, their edge rusher rookie, also left the game with a hip injury. Justin Jefferson, quad contusion, left. He did not return. He's listed as day-to-day. LA Chargers, Justin Herbert, ended up getting x-rays after the game. He got rolled up late in the second half. Says he will know more about the situation in a couple of days. If there was Pacheco news as well, I didn't see it. I'm not pulling it up on the stream on the other side, but that is the injury report. Now, let's get to the market rundown for NFL week number 3. I see the Texans live odds jumping up slightly. Hopefully that means they might have some success on their early drive. Let's get to the market rundown for NFL week number 3 and look at these openers. Now, genuinely, true openers for me in this spot. These are the first time I've looked at these lines, so you get my true thoughts on this as we go. New England on the road to take on the New York Jets. Thursday Night Football. Jets were 6.5-point favorites on the look ahead. They reopen 6.5-point favorites, total 38.5. That's right where we're seeing it as well. As I mentioned, Titans slightly outperformed the Jets in the box score. You could look at that game for the Jets as more a culmination of Titans' mistakes than it was the Jets going out and winning it. I do think you have to believe in how Aaron Rodgers looks and that being a positive, but some serious defensive injuries for the Jets. It'll be interesting to see if this move down potentially, like you can kind of look at that Jets game and say, okay, there's reasons to downgrade it. Are we still at 6.5 because this is the classic new coaching staff first Thursday night game situation where we see teams in this spot consistently underperform? That is certainly applying here to the New England Patriots, and maybe that's keeping things kind of at the level that they are based on what we would have expected from the look ahead. So something to think about as we go through. My initial thought on this, without running any numbers or looking more into detail, is that I would want to know. Yeah, I think it's a pretty good number, quite frankly. I'm looking at this. My hesitation with laying this big of a number, as much as I want to maybe fade the Pats defense initially, is that just the way that Aaron Rodgers is running this offense is just slow, is how I would put it. It's just not quickly paced whatsoever. Chargers, Pittsburgh. It's not fully available for what I'm seeing on the screen. It was Pittsburgh -2 on the look ahead. I'm seeing BetOnline and Pinnacle at 2.5. I'm not seeing a number from Chris. I'm not seeing a number from a couple of other sports books. As I mentioned, Herbert's dealing with x-rays. I don't know the severity of what that injury might actually be, if it's anything at all. So I'm guessing that's the reason why we're seeing this not priced at Chris. Chicago, Indy, still off of the board. Houston, Minnesota, still off of the board. Both of those two teams in action at the moment. New York Giants on the road at the Cleveland Browns. This is an interesting one. Cleveland -6.5 on the look ahead. They're now 7, -105 at Chris, 6.5 at BetOnline, 6.5 at FanDuel. Total 40.5 on the look ahead. Reopens 38. Now, we saw what Daniel Jones and the Giants offense looks like against an aggressive Brian Flores defense. Got a big break against the Washington Commanders. The Giants, as I mentioned, still couldn't capitalize on opportunities. And now you're going from the Commanders defense, which is manageable, to just a hellacious matchup here against the Jim Schwartz-led Cleveland Browns defense. So it's kind of unthinkable that you could get to a point where you're laying this big of a number with a Browns offense that did nothing in week 1 and quite frankly was underwhelming in week 2, scoring 18, aided by a safety and a handful of field goals, only got into the red zone once past that opening scoring drive. How in the world can you get to the point where you're laying that big of a number? Well, when you think about this defensive matchup and what Daniel Jones could look like, you start to kind of believe in why that could be the case. Eagles on the road at the New Orleans Saints. Eagles were 3.5-point favorites on the look ahead. We are seeing this at FanDuel and DK available off the board everywhere else. This is adjusted to the other side of 3. Eagles -2.5. A.J. Brown will not play in Monday Night Football. Enormous status to monitor to see how that carries over into this week. Saints just wildly impressive week 1 and 2. We don't know what we're going to get from the Eagles tomorrow, and that is why this is not widely available yet. Denver on the road at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Bucs 5 on the look ahead adjusted up to 7. The total from 43 down to 39.5, a 4-point adjustment down on the total, a 2-point adjustment up to the key of 7 for Tampa Bay at home. My initial thought is that I want no part of Denver at all. But my hesitance to say that I'm looking at this and I like it is last week in week 2, every time a game got near a key, we saw two-way action on both sides. And so I see 7 right now at Chris, a super short total at 39.5. I know these bigger numbers with shorter totals have really been getting bought on Wednesday morning by different groups. I don't know if I'm like rushing in for this. The Buccaneers offense looked great in week 1. How much was that inflated by the Commanders defense? That is making everybody look good and will all season. Week 2 against the Lions, they didn't have to run very many plays, only 43 of them. But certainly in some numbers looked like they were back down to earth a little bit. Denver Broncos defense, not a big threat. One great corner to match up with Evans, but it's a game where Mayfield should have no problem moving the ball around. Would certainly initially want to look at Tampa here, but just with the way these key numbers have been being bet both ways, not sure if I'm jumping in yet. Green Bay on the road at the Tennessee Titans. Interesting one. 1.5 on the look ahead. Reopen is 1.5 at Chris, 2 at Bet Online, 2 at Pinnacle. Total 39.5 down to 37. So we know the Packers want to run the football. Malik Willis revenge game, going back to Tennessee. The Jordan Love stuff injury-wise, we had like this late chance to play. I don't know if I'm buying into that all the way. The Titans' interior defensive line looks really good to me. And early on in that Jets game, before the Jets were forced to go a little bit more horizontal, really the Jets were not finding any push. Can the Green Bay Packers out-scheme that and overcome that? Perhaps. But boy, in this spot, that becomes a pretty interesting number. A little bit difficult to kind of see what we might be looking at in terms of adjustment. I'll have a better read on how much this number is or isn't adjusted a little bit later when we get some updated prices. But this is a game where I certainly agree with that under coming in based on how we've seen the Titans offense not match what they were expected to be and the Packers going extremely run heavy. Carolina on the road at the Las Vegas Raiders. Raiders were 5 on the look ahead. They're now 7. This is another big spread, low total game is the total from 39.5 down to 37. Carolina was getting just rushed to bet late week at 6.5 at home against the Chargers. They're now getting 7 on the road at the Raiders with even a shorter total. I can't look at the Raiders here. You can't. But like, at what point do you have to stop betting the Panthers because you're getting nothing from the offense? Like Bryce Young against Max Crosby in that pass rush, that doesn't give you any hope. But like numbers wise, how in the world are you getting to a comfortable spot to lay 7 with Las Vegas? Unless you're just completely writing off the Panthers and saying they're a dead team. Total's very short, but obviously deservingly so for how the Panthers offense has been. That's a tough one when you're looking at this. Miami on the road at the Seattle Seahawks. A massive trip across the country for Miami off the mini bye. We don't know what we're getting from Tua, but we do know, we know we're not playing. I'm saying we don't know what we're getting in terms of the adjustment until now. You're looking at Seattle, a 6.5-point favorite. This was Miami -1 on the look ahead. It is, unless something happens last minute with Tannehill coming in for the Dolphins, all signs point to Skylar Thompson starting. This is another game with a quarterback move that's just being inflated quite a bit. Obviously, Seattle takes some home field and adjustment up. That was priced into the look-ahead line. We're now at 7.5 points for Tua to Thompson. And that's not something that I think anybody could agree with. So it's another quarterback game that's inflated. It's a Seahawks offense that looked way different in week 2 than they did week 1. If you think about how the Bills really lined up and took advantage of the Dolphins along with the Jags, there was a lot of success up front in that. Now, Seattle's offensive line is going to be the weakest that Miami has faced up front with their pass rush. That's a big number for Seattle to lay if there's no Kenneth Walker and they don't have a supplementary ground game to go with the pass attack that they have. Certainly the Seattle Seahawks defense up front in the interior is good, but you think about the middle of the field with some of those injuries and Miami's time to prepare, different spot. So this to me is certainly intriguing, getting the Dolphins at this many points. But again, it's another game around a key number. Where is this going to move to? Detroit on the road at the Arizona Cardinals. Indoor game. Lions 4.5-point favorites on the look ahead. It is down to 3. Total in this game from 51.5 up to 52. This to me feels like an over to start at 52, as big of a number as that is, as hard as it is to get to. Arizona is not going to be able to pressure Detroit like Tampa Bay was able to pressure Detroit. When you think about how you beat Arizona, we talk about it a lot. We talked about it earlier on the show. Line up, run the football. But can you trust Ben Johnson to do that? We certainly tailored his game plan to attack the weakness of Tampa Bay. They just didn't execute well. Does he see what has worked against Arizona from the Buffalo game and run the same scheme? It's what everybody wanted on Twitter today. If he does that, I certainly think they move the football. And then you have a Lions secondary, a little bit younger, but also a Lions defense we saw against the Bucs not really get tested. Yeah, I'm looking at this, and let's see if this total comes down. The way some of these games are being bet and trending, and even that game against Tampa Bay with all of the injuries and all the issues and all the matchups, that was still a game that I found myself on the under as we went back to the preview, and you're looking at that number, and you just could never get there. My initial thought here, without looking at some more numbers, is that this is a game that could shape up to be an absolute shootout with both teams moving the football. Baltimore on the road at the Dallas Cowboys. Dallas was a 1-point favorite on the look ahead. This is now Baltimore, a 1-point favorite coming into Dallas. Total in this game, 47.5. That is reopened at the same price. I don't have much of a thought on this one at the moment. San Francisco on the road at the LA Rams. This was San Francisco minus 4.5 on the look ahead. It is out to 7.5 currently. Total from 48 down to 45.5. We've got so much to think about here for the Rams injury situation. O-line, Kupp, Nakua. If Kupp is unable to go, we know Puka's on IR. If the O-line still has issues, this probably hasn't been adjusted up enough. Kansas City, Atlanta, still off of the board with the Falcons playing on Monday Night Football. Monday night in week 3 is a doubleheader. Jacksonville, Buffalo is the early kick. Buffalo is 3.5-point favorite on the look ahead. This has been adjusted out to -6 on the heels of the Bills putting forth a very impressive performance on Thursday Night Football. Total in this game, 47.5 down to 46.5. My initial impression is that's an awfully big bump up for the Buffalo Bills in this spot. How many times can they continue to come up with a fantastic game plan for defensive injuries to be negated? Boy, that's a big adjustment up for how these games this week have gone. Certainly, if you're looking at the Jags box score as anything of a misleading victory. Washington on the road at the Cincinnati Bengals. Oh, Cincinnati was a 1.5-point favorite on the look-ahead line. We are out to Cincinnati minus 7.5. Boy, that's a big number and a big adjustment up. The total 47.5, sitting at 47 as well. Cincinnati is a team that I'll have to look at to see what we get from T. Higgins. You would certainly think they're going to have no issues moving the football. And then you have Lou Anarumo against a rookie QB going on the road, in this case, to play in Cincinnati, which is a pretty decent spot for this Bengals defense that's been very underwhelming to this point. The question is, how much can you trust this offense, as bad as the Commanders' defense might be, to make up for that defense that, again, really underperformed against New England, and then is in a spot now where they're laying another very big number after not being able to win and cover in week number 1. So interesting week of games. We still have 4 or 5 games that are still off of the board. A couple big adjustments that, in my opinion, might provide opportunity coming back the other way, but a lot to look at and a lot to think about on these week 1 cards, or week 3 card, pardon me. Appreciate everybody for stopping by here on the show this Sunday evening. As I'm looking at it right now, first quarter, 3 minutes left, 3-3, Chicago Bears, Houston Texans. Hopefully a sign of things to continue into the second quarter because we're looking at that first half under and the Texans on the side. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by. Lots of questions in the chat. We just went too long. I'll read back through all of them. If you have more that you want to leave down below in the comment section, I can reply to those at any time, but just kind of fell behind a little bit and time-wise was up against it. So I'll get to a lot of the questions if you leave them down below in the comments if you want anything answered immediately. Thanks again for stopping by. Enjoy Sunday Night Football. Enjoy Monday Night Football as well, and we'll talk to you back here on the podcast feed and on YouTube on Tuesday morning.